My discussion today, I want to emphasize, is really a very basic introduction to the issues that anybody who is thinking about personal digital archiving needs to keep in mind. We live in a world where we're rapidly assembling growing amounts of information in different formats. We're creating, we're collecting, we're building gigantic collections of material for ourselves. And we're storing that material in many different places, whether it be on our laptop, whether it be in the cloud, whether it be on a host of different handheld devices or recording instruments. This vast array of material reflects the fact that we are at the latest stage in what has been a long historic evolution of great leaps forward in communications technology. And each of those steps has taken us forward a quantum leap each time in terms of greater power, flexibility, reach, and tragically, somewhat, greater vulnerability of materials. So the problem with digital media is that without mediation, digital data is not much use to most of us. I couldn't resist showing this small detail of a portrait of Andy Warhol, which I think he would appreciate, shown to you without mediation. And it shows how useless this material can be without that mediation. That vulnerability, though, expresses itself in far less amusing ways. For example, the potential for disaster of all kinds, the sort of home fire, the flood, the spilled coffee, the theft of our dissertation from the back seat of our car. It gets reported every couple of years. The horrible virus that lands on our computer and destroys everything. But more than that, the potential for obsolescence. I'm showing some of the most burning examples of media that has ceased to be useful, but every day, I can assure you, new media is going out of date. New types of storage devices, new types of hardware that are not very important anymore. And add to that the fact that data sitting quietly on the shelf in our office is often just slowly decaying. And when we go back to it a few years later, we can no longer read it. And then there are those like myself who know they have the file somewhere, but if it's not organized, what good does it do? So the object of my discussion today is to suggest that we all seize the day. And this is perhaps a rather grim image, but it suggests, I think, the urgency of the problem that most of us are facing. I suspect that all of us do some kind of job to preserve our data, but I'd be willing to bet that most of us don't do nearly what we need to do to preserve it. And the tragedy is that at the base of this are really some just basic good habits along the line of you should exercise frequently, you should eat healthy foods. There are a set of best practices that are emerging, and it's for that reason that this group has come together at Columbia to try to help people to think about archiving their digital data. And I want to just talk really basically about the baseline of what is involved there. So let's go ahead and take a look. In terms of the basic concepts, it's important to remember when you're talking about saving these, you're talking about saving your files. You're not talking about saving the media. Forget about that USB drive. It's going to be dead in a couple of years. Forget about that DVD. Forget about the places where it's stored. Your files, if they have a long, healthy life, are going to pass on as cyber objects to a completely different environment somewhere else. There's another issue that we need to think about. There are two pieces to this process. Most of us probably all back up our data from time to time. I hope we do, so that your dissertation isn't on just that one laptop, so it can be stolen from the back of your car, unless that's what you really are hoping for. But there's also the question of archiving, that longer-term storage. Maybe you don't need every state of your dissertation. Maybe you don't need every photo that you took of your family on their vacation. You need to pull things out. You might also not want to store, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment, things in formats that are used by the software you currently have. Another piece of the process you need to think about is who are you saving for? You're saving for yourself right now, and often only you will care about having the materials you're using for writing that article. There are other things on your computer you probably never want to pass down to another generation, but there are other things that you probably do, things that are going to be of lasting value, whether for the scholarly community or for your family. And that's what archiving is all about. It's thinking about the long term. It's thinking about the time that you won't be around and somebody else will need to figure out what is there. And so the next point that's a little related to that you want to think about is in terms of archiving, there are light archives and there are dark archives. You'll have archives where you want to go back to the shelf, pull something off, and get it to work because it's died on your machine. But there'll also be an archive perhaps where you want to keep things quietly and untouched. And often those will be stored in formats that you can't use so regularly, particularly when you talk about things like video and other kinds of media. One thing that most people who talk about digital archiving suggest, and it's the kind of thing that I just think, oh gosh, I can't do this, is that you should write an explicit archiving policy for yourself. Sitting down and putting it, I don't want to say on paper because that's not where you put it anymore. Putting it on your computer is a good idea to really tell yourself. It's a chance to do an inventory. What have you got to save? What do you want to save? Where do you want to save it? When do you want to save it? And how do you want to save it? This is a tiny little suggestion of a sort of very low-level sample text policy that Alyssa Krosky, who used to be with us at Barnard, put together for a workshop she was doing, talking about how she decides what she's going to save or not. Once you get your materials, though, off of the devices you have them in, your job is to organize them. And there are several pieces to keep in mind. Obviously, I think the goal is to get one consolidated archive. Don't have it on multiple devices. Secondly, you want to try as much as possible to get things into uniform formats and open formats. Now, mind you, if these are things you're going to take back and use with your current software, you don't need to care about that. But when you're talking about things to share with others, you want to talk about open formats. And what do I mean by open formats? We're talking about things that are not dependent on a single software to see. So the simplest way of talking about that, not a doc file, but a text file or an open text document file. A file perhaps with some markup. Not perhaps an Excel spreadsheet, but a comma-delimited version of that spreadsheet that can be passed on to future generations without depending on a particular software. You also want to come up with a clear and logical file and directory structure. Those of you who are using personal bibliographic software may find that a good way to at least start conceptualizing about how your research comes together in a particular file. Another important thing is coming up with self-explanatory file naming conventions. I think we've all seen 2 years after the fact that it would have been nicer if we really told ourselves what that file was. But think of how your camera outputs things that are just numbers. You want to come up with something that not only you, but somebody later, if you want to preserve this for a long time, will be able to understand. Another thing is to try to document as much as possible where this came from, how it was created, the parameters that may be important for using it later. The more you get into multimedia, the more important this becomes. It's all talking about what is sometimes fearsomely referred to as metadata, but there's a low level of this just to keep track of where you got it. And some of the documentation I'll show you later can help you decide how much metadata you need. You can often extract it from the data you have too. The other thing you want to do when you're organizing it is get rid of the unneeded clutter. That's the stuff that's going to prevent you from seeing what was most important there. So let's go on and talk about that. Once you put it in your archive, you can't just leave it there. You've got to keep it alive. That data is going to die if it's just left alone in a corner to suck its thumb. Part of that ensuring and maintaining is, of course, to have a regular established backup and maintenance calendar. Some of you may have that hardwired in yourself. I don't. I have to write those things down for myself so that my Google Calendar will tell me it's the day to back up. But there's another thing that you want to do. You certainly don't want to have just one copy. For my sense of security, and I think a lot of people suggest that you want to have 3 copies of your stuff. That way, when one of them dies, you don't have to panic that you only have 1 copy of your archive left. And don't keep them in the same place. Maybe one in the cloud, another on a hard drive. If you have a huge computer, you can have one on your own computer, but I actually prefer 2 hard drives instead. Another suggestion is that you need to replace your storage media fairly often, and it seems to be that the standard rule of thumb is every 5 years is a safe way to look, but you're going to be checking on your data from time to time to see if you need to do it sooner. You also, particularly for media, need to think about migrating formats forward. As software changes, it may become the fact that you can still convert from this version to the next, and if you don't hurry up, you can still do it again, but if you don't convert after that point, you may find you've got a little lost piece of media that is hard to use with anything else. And for those things that you really want to share with others, be sure to think about an institutional repository option for yourself, whether it be something that a place like Columbia runs or something that your professional organization runs. The Library of Congress spells this out a different way, but I think if we just tick down this list, we can see the same things. What you need to do is identify your data. Then what you need to do is decide what you're going to save. Then you need to export it from those devices. Then you need to organize it. And lastly, you need to copy and manage that data to work with it. Now, the devil is in the details. These are wonderful principles I've suggested. It's going to be different for each one of you. And thankfully, 2 members of our team, Heidi Winston and Dina Sokolova, have done a great job of identifying some of the online sites where you can find interesting information about how to deal with these issues. It doesn't, the page does not yet have a permanent home, so I have parked it temporarily on the Digital Humanities Center page. There's just a link here to personal digital archiving. When you click on that link, it will take you through, after some blah blah from me, to a page where you get this information. And these tabs give you an idea of what's here. And I just want to close by telling you, these are the topics you need to be thinking about, and this is where you can get some good detail. An overview of the best practices, the kinds of things I've talked about, presented in a much more articulate fashion. The issues that one needs to think about in dealing with different media type, whether it be video, audio, spreadsheets, text, photographs, and on and on. Some good links to talk about techniques and tools for backing up and recovering your data. Some sites that help to assess some of the online storage options that are out there and to try to rank them and talk about the issues you need to think about when you're picking a good one. A nice set of tools for doing some batch file renaming to make your photographs much more intelligible to a future generation. And some tools for extracting the kind of metadata, documentation about your files, from the files themselves. Next to last, a set of listings of what the best open file formats are. Sadly, there isn't one consensus about these things, and it's constantly changing, but the page can help you to decide what's going to be best for you. And lastly, a set of tools that will help you to convert those things as you move along. So that's all that I want to say right now. My colleagues are going to tell you a little bit more in detail about some of the issues that we've discussed here today.
So the main question then that you ask is, what happened to my file 10 years from now? You know, and there's two things that might have happened with it. You just can't find it; it's there, or it's just not there. This is what? So the answer. My answer about to personal digital archiving is a little different than the mainstream because I consider archiving and the research process to be intertwined with each other. They don't happen at separate moments. They happen simultaneously. So it's important to always, at least for me, to keep that in mind as I am working on any particular research project that there's archiving issues involved. This is the typical one where you start your research and then you store it somewhere, what I'm calling archiving there. And then you start drafting your paper, or the results of your research, and then you can't find that thing that you were looking for. And like I said, it's either because it's there and you can't find it, or you lost it. So two keywords that I want you to take home with you is organization and preservation. And they're intertwined. We're going to talk about them separately, but I want you to reunite them in your head later. Organization, preservation. So organization means mostly that you want to see a future version of yourself searching for something. So you don't have to associate it with an obsessive-compulsive disorder or any of these things. It's just a little bit of futurology. So the way that we organize, at least the way that I organize, is by making sure that I have enough information around any particular object that I'm working with. So I thought that this talk was meant mostly for undergraduates. So I kind of, this one was explaining what metadata is. But in case you needed a refresher, here is where you add information about other information. So there's two ways that you're going to encounter out there to actually add this information at the most basic level, not at the level of where the library adds metadata or where digital archives add metadata, but when you're working with files. You can either put the metadata inside the file. For example, when you open up a Microsoft Word, you can click on File and go to Properties. It's going to open up that window. And that's where you put the information. And that metadata now is going to be stored in the file. The other option is to have a tool itself that adds the metadata for you and keeps the metadata separate from the item. So in this particular case, it's an example from Zotero. So that's important to keep in mind because the search strategies that you're going to use in the future have to revolve around where that metadata is, whether it's inside the file or it's outside the file. And I'll give you some tips about that in the next at the end. But for now, I just want you to imprint this on your brain. Don't wait to write the metadata. Every time you find a little bit, an object that you want to examine, add the metadata right there. If you postpone it, you will accumulate a bunch of files, and you're not going to feel like doing them. You're not going to find the time to do it, and this is going to make your life impossible. Trust me, I took a while to finish grad school, and it was mostly because I spent 3 years organizing my metadata. That might be an exaggeration, but all right. That only leaves the question of whether it's going to be there or not in the future, and I think Bob gave some really good tips on how to preserve it. I think I can summarize it in the next slide, which is there is 4 options that I think should be on everybody's workflow right now. So you start, you work on your PC, right? And you're going to have 2 external hard drives, one in your house and the other one in Alaska. The reason is because of fires. You don't want to have that hard disk inside your house. And also, this is the hard drive where you back up to once a year. Only you don't have, this is not the one that you back up once every week. So in the one at your house, you back up once a week. But at the same time, you also have a cloud backup. So you have some kind of service that extracts the data. Amazon is the one that I use. It's pretty good. And they do it automatically. You just tell them what folder you want them to grab every month. You don't have to worry about it. It works the same for your external hard drive. You don't have to remind yourself. This can be done automatically. And of course, there's another form of backup, but it's not considered backup, which is the syncing across different machines. That is itself a good strategy to have beside your regular backups because it means that my laptop in the office is going to have the same files as the laptop at home. Actually, with the cloud syncing that I use is Dropbox. I actually have those files also online. So it's different than the backup of the cloud. But it's just an extra security step. So chances are I'll not lose my data. And because of the cloud syncing and the cloud backup, the data can survive, even despite of the machines. Because the hard drives might die, but the cloud people, they are committed. You're paying them money so that they can keep that data alive, or at least safe from byte rot, but probably not safe from a file format that goes out of existence. So everything that Bob said was very relevant to this. So the problem is there's too many tools to do research, and by extension to do archiving. And there are too many file types. So the idea here is you pick this up with experience. I don't know if there's any hard and fast rule to do this. I can of course meet with anybody and give them some tips depending on their project. But the one bit of Chinese cookie wisdom that you want to take with you is that you always want the right tool for the right job. This is something Rebecca Kennison will also tell you all the time. Right tool for the right job. And by job, I mean here projects. So I work with projects. Maybe people don't organize their lives around projects. I always have different projects. And different projects have, for me, a different set of combination of tools that work really well for that. I wouldn't recommend applying the same tools to the same projects for many reasons. And one of the things that I did, and I want to spend my last 2 minutes or 1 minute talking about, is a sample project. This is the workflow that I used to work on my dissertation. So I use Evernote to kind of just think through a problem. And Evernote is good because you can web clip from the web. You can take down anything, but also you can annotate it. You can write little notes, little pictures, sound bites, whatever. But then that stuff is only organized by tags. So sorting through it, like I said, you have to use the right metadata. Sorting through it will require you to be able to search for the right keywords that you were thinking through. Eventually, when I start drafting, then I put it into a tool that's meant for writing papers. Zotero, it's a bibliographic tool. Happens to handle the same file types as Evernote. So it can take a PDF, it can take a Microsoft Word document, it can take most of the common file types that you guys are familiar with. So it's very easy for me then to just take the stuff that I want from that Evernote, from that soup organic soup that I made in Evernote and more or less give it shape. After that, then I do the project. I am ready to send then copies of my Zotero database to the four corners of the earth. Actually, not after. While I'm doing it, there are that Zotero database with the files, with my notes, with the metadata, is the thing that is being backed up. So this is just one example. You can do this in so many different ways. The important thing is that you figure it out exactly the right configuration for your job. So come talk to me after if you have questions of what this might be for your project. Thank you.
I'm Nick Patterson, a music librarian in the Music and Arts Library. And we're going to take a little detour into the world of audio file formats and archiving. And we're going to look backwards a little bit because we've been looking so far at things that are already in digital form, and this is on digital archiving, but a lot of the questions that come up vis-a-vis audio are actually to do with transferring items from the old analog world into digital formats and storing them. And I'm going to say much of the same that my colleagues have also said. It's beginning to feel a little bit like a revival meeting. We're all like, I have an archiving problem, and I'm here today to talk to you about it. So here are some of the formats that we have to deal with, and these are things that come up often in the music library. We see magnetic reel-to-reel tape. We have LP, vinyl LPs, digital audio tape, VHS videotape, cassettes, 8 tracks. I'm happy to say we've managed to keep out of the collection so far, so we don't have to deal with those, and some other esoteric formats down in the bottom there. But the key things to think about with audio and video are the audio formats themselves for both the analog and the digital files. When we're going back into the analog world, we have to think about the playback equipment that's going to be able to bring those formats into the digital realm, so that's a major thing to think about. The encoding equipment, which we're going to use to actually do the digital files from analog sources. And that brings up the issue of storage requirements, because a lot of these audio and video files are massive, especially video. I'll just put a disclaimer in here that video is not really my expertise. It's kind of just along for the ride here. A lot of the issues are the same, but most of the tools that I'm going to be talking about today are specific to audio. And then lastly, there's the issue you've heard about of metadata, which is critical for all of these various digital archiving things. So, triage. My first suggestion here echoes what you've heard already, which is that I think the critical thing is to decide out of the files you have which are the ones that are really important to preserve. I think for audio, most of us probably have the experience where we have, casual listening files that we may have downloaded that we don't really care if they're around next summer, but we then have things that might be oral histories or family audio that we might want to have in 20 or 30 years. So you're going to make different choices based on the actual type of material that you're looking at. And I think one of the most important places to start is just to do a survey of the materials that you have in audio and video format and make some decisions about what's critical, what's casual, you don't really care about losing it in a year or two. Medium, you want to keep it for a couple of years, you may want to refer to it. And then critical, you have to have that. You're going to make different decisions in archiving based on those things. And not everything makes it out alive. This is okay, folks. We can all agree that it's okay to let some of this stuff go. I mean, from personal experience, I think it's important to parse your content and realize, because otherwise it's really honestly an unmanageable task. You have to identify the stuff that's really critical and be prepared to let some of it suffer from natural bit rot decay, and it's going to go. Okay, so going back to the split between born digital and analog, just different considerations. Analog, older audio has special things that have to be thought about. The conditions of the originals have to be taken into account. In many cases, analog formats, it may be the last time you're able to actually play the cassette, the tape, the LP. So you need a strategy in advance to be prepared to capture that at the time of playback, and that may be the last opportunity you have to do it. So that brings in the issues of playback equipment. We've actually, over in the library, just had both of our cassette decks fail. We have thousands of cassettes in offsite storage from South Asian music. I've just been shopping for pro quality cassette decks, and They're very, very hard to get now. You can still get consumer-grade combo players, but the professional audio decks are getting already almost impossible to find. So something to think about. Making decisions on the encoding rates for the audio that you're going to be capturing if you're dealing with analog formats is important. We'll talk about that a little later. And then once again, metadata capture, going back to what Alex was saying, make sure at the time of doing this, if it's Aunt B playing the piano in 1945, future generations aren't going to know that, so write it down, get it in there. For stuff which is born digital already, you have basically the file format in which you've received the document is what you have to live with. If you are actually creating the digital file, then the same things apply in terms of choosing your bit rate and your sample rate and all that kind of thing. And then lastly, our favorite thing, DRM, digital rights management schemes, which thankfully seem to be fading over time, but it is something that we have to think about in terms of files that you may have purchased that have restricted uses. You can only use it on this machine. You can't copy it to that machine. These are things that come up sometimes when you're trying to deal with backup issues on some of these files and being able to access them from different locations, having authorized computers, authorized files. And then both formats require thinking about storage, the metadata again, we'll hammer that home, and access and file management, going back to what Bob was saying earlier about naming. I think we can all agree on naming conventions for files. Really important to put something in the name. We may all have had the experience with an iTunes file where, the metadata wasn't in there in the first, the tags weren't there, the metadata wasn't there, and the file says, great jam or something, and that's all you have. So that's kind of a sad state. Some of you may be familiar with this already, but I want to just go over these basics in case you haven't heard of these. So when you're dealing with audio encoding for digital storage, you have two basic methods of encoding. You have lossy formats and lossless formats, and they are just what they sound like. Lossy means that some of the information in the audio recording is actually lost during the process of encoding. The reason that you do it is because you want smaller file size. So that would be the classic is MP3. It uses certain psychoacoustic techniques to try and make the file sound the same, but by getting rid of a lot of extraneous material that you can get away with and have something which is still in the zone. AAC, Apple's format, is also a lossy format. Ogg Vorbis, which is a kind of esoteric, bit of a hacker format, but it's around. And there's several other lossy formats. So with any of those, if you're dealing with audio that you're creating, you want to be thinking about probably not using those to create your initial files. You want to do that in a lossless format. And those examples would be WAV, AIFF, those are the two most common. Apple has a lossless format. FLAC is a popular format which you'll see with a lot of internet-based albums that are being made available in the lossless format are often provided that way. And lastly, this is one that many people may not have heard of but is interesting to know about, which is the broadcast WAV file. This is an archival format. And the thing that's good about it is that it allows you to put metadata in the audio file itself. You need some esoteric tools to do it, but you are able to actually get metadata in the audio file as part of the file, not as an external thing. So sample and bit rates, what you hear of as CD quality, actual real CD quality is 44.1 kilohertz, 16-bit quality. You'll see CD quality bandied around a lot by vendors, and when they don't actually mean that at all, they mean some streaming format. So you have to pay attention to these things, which is why I'm featuring them here today. Just be aware of the issue of sample rates and bit rates. When you're choosing to encode something, and the example I will use is iTunes, since most people probably use iTunes, there are default settings for how that stuff is being encoded as an MP3 when you create it. You may not be aware of that, but there are settings in there which you can go in and you can tweak. Now, there are some limits to what you can do with MP3, but if you don't touch it, it's probably not going to pick the best output. If you go into preferences, you can go in and set those to more optimal things. A lot of recordings are now being released in 96K 24-bit, which is more of an archival and a pro quality format. Again, that means your files are getting larger. And then you'll also see 88.2 and 192 kilohertz. These are kind of esoteric formats that are more audio engineer type things and probably not ones that most people have to worry about for their own stuff. But just to recap the storage requirements here. So a minute of stereo audio CD quality is 10 megs. So we're very quickly filling up stuff. Now drives are getting bigger and bigger all the time. It's easier to do, but it's something you have to think about once you have thousands and thousands of audio selections. Minute of stereo audio at MP3 depends on your encoding options that you take, so ranging from 240K up to 2.3 megs. So that's a significant factor in terms of size and something to think about. When we enter the world of video, things get scary. Digital video, 200 megs per minute. HD, 10 gigs. So astronomical amounts. That's with stereo audio and joined to the audio. iTunes is the gorilla in the room. How many of you use iTunes to do your personal audio file management? Actually, fewer than I thought. Interesting. No, they're there. They're just slow hands coming up slowly here. So that's your audio file. Looking a little worried that it may not survive this process. So iTunes, I just wanted to mention a couple things that may not be obvious in iTunes. You may know this already, but forgive me for just going through these things. The default setting for audio encoding, which I mentioned, is under Preferences. You should take a look there and see what is set. You can choose in what file format iTunes is ripping audio from either a CD source or whatever you're flying into it. Usually out of the box, I think it's set to AAC, is Apple's preferred format. But there may be situations in which you want to pull that audio in at actual CD quality, and you'll have to go in there and change that preference to AIFF or WAV for that. So that's just something to think about. You have to be prepared to deal with the file sizes with that, but it's recommended basically to capture your audio at the highest quality you can, and then if you want essentially a service copy to take on your iPod or use in some other context, shrink it down, have 2 copies, but get your original copy at the highest possible sample rate and bit rate that you can. I personally use some hacks, small hacks in iTunes just to live with the file structure that they force you into. I like to use the comments field to put in my own text that I want to be able to search for. This is more of an organizational thing. It's kind of a pre-archiving thing than an actual archiving thing. But you can use free text in comments and use it to retrieve whatever files you want. You can use asterisk or some symbol or some text, and it will be searchable as a keyword. But you do have to have comments turned on as a view option in your list of iTunes tracks in order to retrieve it, so just bear that in mind. All of the tags that you have access to, if you've ever looked at the info on an iTunes track there, that is metadata. You're able to put that in. When you put a CD in and it pulls stuff down, it will actually go and pull stuff from Gracenote or some place on the web to try and get the tracks in. If you've noticed, if you're offline, that you're not getting actual tracks, that's because there's nowhere for it to pull from. So get in there and hand code as much as possible. If you have the spirit to do that, you're going to get the best quality metadata by going in and hand coding there. You can also work on several files at the same time. So some best practices very quickly. For high fidelity music, 96K 24-bit is a good standard to have just in terms of capturing your audio. If you're working from a CD, there's no point in going higher than the CD is already. You may as well just use the 44.1 16-bit. That's the existing top level. Just realize that every time you step down or encode in a lossy format, you're losing stuff which can no longer be retrieved. You can't step back up. So every time you go down, you're losing a step of that fidelity. And you want to at least keep your original archived copy in the highest quality encoding that you can. For some material like spoken word and older historical audio, you can get away with lower frequency recording if size is really important in your storage issues. But if you don't have to, it doesn't hurt just to have a uniform, high quality format. Once again, broadcast WAV file allows you to put metadata in the audio file itself. It's pretty geeky. It's only if you have really serious archived audio that you may want to get into it and keep things like edit logs of what you did to the file, how you processed it, when it was done, stuff like that. Backup again, evangelism, external hard drive, and preferably 2. Mean time between failures, sorry I got that wrong, but it is failure. Drives will fail. inevitably. You can be guaranteed of that, so keep migrating the stuff. I personally use an external drive, a second drive, not in Alaska because I'm not as wise as Alex is. But the cloud is also an important part of that. I will say that the uploading is a little tricky. I'm going to ask Alex for pointers about that later because large file sizes, there's some issues with getting the stuff up there. And for really, really important stuff, the broadcast WAV file format also allows you to do a checksum on the file, which is for really critical stuff. If you want to make sure that when you're moving it between these various locations, that it's a bit perfect copy, that nothing has changed in moving from one place to the other. This is getting into forensic audio stuff, but for the really critical stuff, it can be important over time. That can corrupt files, so that's the last thing there. And then I just close with a couple resources here very quickly. We'll just go through the Digital Music Lab and the Music and Arts Library. We have equipment that may assist you in some of this work. We have audio editing. We have software to do encoding of original stuff. If you have format transfers, we have cassette and LP equipment that you can encode stuff with there. Batch processing, which Bob mentioned, is possible for renaming files and also processing files in batches. For iTunes, Doug's Apple scripts, if you're not familiar with them, are a good thing to know. There's lots of user-contributed Apple scripts that do a lot of useful things that iTunes is unable to do or unwilling to do. And then BWF MetaEdit is an open source project for working with broadcast WAV files. Lossless editing for MP3s and music metadata source. Sorry, I think I've gone a little over time, but that's it for me.
Hello. I would also, since there is quite a bit of redundancy in our presentation, I'll try to skip through the stuff that I think other people already mentioned. But one thing that is that I want to emphasize is that right now you are actually encountering with the volatility and the importance of the digital materials. Most people become aware of what archivists that deal with historical documents have been aware already for many, many years and decades, that how unstable the information is and what exactly the necessary techniques and methods are in order to keep it there and keep it accessible. So in a way, we find the more we work with digital files, the more we find out that all the tools we developed for, at least intellectual tools that we developed for analog collections, actually fit quite well into the digital realm. And I mostly would like to share them with you because more or less, you all are your own archivists by now. So just so you see what is in the electronic records and the special collections right now, at least in Columbia University, is, of course, the digitized materials that are copies of your old analog originals, of, let's say, various older paper documents that were digitized for ease of access. There are publications and research materials that now end up in the academic commons, unlike older theses and dissertations that are in the university archives in hard copies. There are websites, and there is all kind of other digital-born materials, which consist of multiple formats, with new formats coming up every year, and which is generally not something you can just memorize once because things change faster than you can memorize them. So when you are your own archivist, you just you follow the steps that we always followed when we dealt with whatever collections and whatever formats that come our way. So first is identify the scope and the purpose of your collection, which is most of the previous presenters emphasize that, how important it is to keep track of everything you do while you do it, which is ideal, but it's not always the case when it's not always possible, because there could be situations when something started and you didn't know it will grow up into something interesting, or you realize that some social network chatter that you conducted for a while actually grew up in an interesting project, and now it has to be saved as a part of the project. So basically, while sometimes that you're dealing with a great that you're dealing with something important and you can't keep track of it as you go. Sometimes you just realize after a while that you have a bunch of digital materials that you need to archive somehow and figure out which ones of them are more important than the others. And this is basically analogous to our archival world, where we have ongoing institutional donors with whom we give them all kinds of guidelines and ask them to follow conventions and to keep the metadata as they go along. Or we have archives that we accession from, I don't know, a great writers who never kept any track of his materials. So then you just get whatever you get and you try to figure out what's the best way to deal with it once you have it. So in a way, that's the same thing. If you neglected to keep track of your materials, and now you want to, don't panic, it's okay. You just start with the first step and identify what's the scope of the things you need to collect. Then, if you identify it right, then you select whatever is within your scope and what's outside. Then you see how you can do minimal arrangement and description so that you can navigate the materials and they are useful. And what's the best preservation and storage methods, and then you figure out what kind of access you want to give yourself or the word for that. So basically, you all saw the Elisa Krosky definition. I pared mine down to two answers. What exactly is the digital materials that you collect pertain to, and what kind of purpose they're supposed to serve. And these decisions will basically define your further steps. Because let's say, for example, if the materials are for the purpose of being open to public, and they generate in the capacity of Columbia, student or affiliate, then you can, let's say, archive it in the academic commons. So that would determine your future ways. Then you sit down, and once you have the scope of your collection, you just sit down and list everything that you can think of that documents it digitally. So you have, let's say, this list that, okay, I want to archive everything that has to do with my Columbia-affiliated activities. And then you sit down and you write down everything that you can think of, all kinds of documents you have that document them. So then, the next steps is you convert your data into relatively stable formats. I say relatively because those things can change. And you copy your files to as it's been told, to external hard drive and to the cloud storage. In some complex cases, you try to evaluate if it's used some sort of complicated software, what you can do with it, and how much of it you need to preserve. And of course, you try to see if your files are organized in any sort of meaningful hierarchical manner. If they're not, you try to do your best job in organizing it. If you don't have time or ability to do the tags and detailed metadata, at least concentrate on your naming conventions. Because, if you have at least the file names that are descriptive, it's much better than nothing. So in the situation where you're dealing with a lot of materials and you cannot do the full-scale job, just do whatever job you can that, will make you able to navigate things. And that's, of course, proudly called content-related metadata. Basically, don't panic about the new formats or new tools that appear on the digital world, and I wouldn't try to memorize exactly, okay, what are the best format for preserving things right now, because again, those things may change, and Google is your friend. And let's say if you have a Facebook account and you suddenly realize it's important for your professional work and you want to preserve it, what you do is you Google locally saving your Facebook account or Google-based email or whatever it is. There is usually a turnkey solution. So there's usually more than one turnkey solution. So it's not about keeping track of every technological development. It's mostly just listing the specific items you want to deal with, and then you'll probably find the solution someplace. You don't need to know it up front. And the same goes for social media, for your blogs, for everything, for all the new stuff that might be coming your way in the next few years. So for more updated information, there are sites that have been around for some time and probably will be around to give you guidelines for specific formats and details. But mostly, again, it's mostly intellectual, conceptual work that you need to be done, and everything else can be looked up. So, so I'd say instead of memorizing what are the best formats or what's, like various technical details, the most important thing is to figure out what exactly you want to keep and how do you want these things to be accessed. And then a lot of other decisions will come from that. Okay, thank you.
So because of time, I'm not going to give my full presentation because basically what it boils down to is that Academic Commons is the place where Columbia and Columbia-affiliated researchers, that students, faculty, can archive their scholarly works. And we, have all of those off-site backups, multiple checksums. We register permanent URLs. In other words, we follow all the best practices in order to make sure that your scholarly content will survive for the future, including adding all that wonderful metadata that you may not have done yourself in order to ensure that it's accessible through Google and Bing and Google Scholar and all of those sorts of resources, as well as Clio Beta, the new search and discovery tool for the Columbia Library's collections. So that's really the gist of what I have to say, but also to say that, as you can tell, there is a lot of expertise here in Columbia University Libraries to help you deal with these issues. There are a number of digital centers, the Digital Humanities Center, the Digital Science Center, the Digital Social Science Center, and as well as the Center for Digital Research and Scholarship and the Digital Music Lab. So please visit the library's website and you can see all these centers and come visit us, ask us questions. We've also recently launched an email account that goes to a working group of people in this area, pdarchiving@libraries.columbia.edu. If you send your questions to that list, someone from among that group should be able to either answer it directly or point you to a place where you can find the answer to your question. Any questions from the floor?
Hi, I'd like to ask a question about the archiving in Alaska. So if I have a hard drive that I can actually credibly have somewhere else, offsite, what's the best software solution to ensure regular backups?
American Airlines. I have a hard drive in my mom's house in the Dominican Republic. I visit the Dominican Republic at least once a year. But of course, it doesn't have to be Alaska. It could be your neighbor across, in Brooklyn or something like that.
But there is no credible software solution to ensure the
continuance. So what happens is what I do is once a year. So I have my cloud backup at Amazon, right? So the one I'm about to switch plans right now because Amazon is offering something really cool right now, which is like you can upload a bunch of stuff. So this is the solution for audio, like gigabytes and gigabytes you can upload as long as you don't check them out. As long as you leave them there and don't touch them. I can't remember the name of the program right now. I have it written down because I heard about it recently. Do you know the name of this thing?
I've heard of it, but I don't know the name of it.
Yeah, so this is one. It's like a savings account, right? You're going to pay a penalty or an IRA. You're going to take a penalty if you take stuff out. So what I do is in this one, the one that I have is similar to that one, but I pay more because I can take stuff, but I'm going to go cheaper now. In this one, what I just continue doing just once a year, I take it I take a copy from my Dropbox and just back it up. That's the other thing. I put everything. I don't really use any other folder in my computer other than the Dropbox folder. I paid like $20 a month to have a lot of gigabytes in there, and then I have a lot of free ones because I convince other people. But then I have everything that I need there, and then I do have videos and audio files that I don't have in my Dropbox because they're big. So what I do is I take those on my physical hard drive, and then just make a clone of the hard drive. And it's probably overkill. But it's just in case that Dropbox goes out of business, Amazon goes out of business, and then probably the least of my problems will be my files by then. But I don't know. That's the answer. There is no software solution to port that stuff out to the hard drive, other than maybe a P2P with my mom. But having her run that over there is probably not the best way to go.
And what you just mentioned, and I think, and also some of the other links I assume we could put up on the pages that Rob just showed us in terms of resources too. So.
Oh yeah, we can put a list of like what are the solutions available for like long-term storage, for short-term storage, for syncing. Yeah, even some brands of like hard disks that are good. I don't know, maybe.
So what about services like Dropbox and any kind of user agreements, proprietary issues that may come up around using these services, particularly the free versions?
Sure, that's a great point. And actually one of the centers I didn't mention in the libraries is we actually have a copyright advisory office, and they have a great website that touches on a lot of intellectual property issues around scholarship and around the work you create. So I recommend that as a resource just to familiarize yourself with those issues broadly. But in terms of agreements, it is important to read those licensing agreements, because the license agreement with Evernote is much different from the one with Google. For example, Google's going to want to look at everything you have and drop in advertising wherever they can and those sorts of things. And Evernote, the folks behind that are much more oriented towards protecting privacy, and so they actually have much better, standards in terms
Dropbox,
of.
too.
Right, and Dropbox as well. And again, Zotero, comes out of an academic environment, so similarly is going to have better standards behind it. But you definitely want to take a look at those licenses and really understand: are you actually handing over the keys to your files by signing up for a particular service? Because you might well be.
But that's the other thing too. For the most part. So I guess it comes down to personal preference. Like I stopped caring and worrying about whether anybody's doing a search through all my files or my online identity or anything. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit narcissistic, so it's like, oh no, they're looking at me. So I guess it depends. But if you're more on the narcissistic or than on the paranoia side, then things are much easier. The paranoia comes with a lot more work, but of course I'd be happy to work with any kind of paranoia server.
Yeah, I'm going to speak to the personal side of digital archiving rather than I'm at school and I'm writing a paper, I need to research, use Evernote, and say something that a lot of people I think feel but don't want to talk about, which is, are we over archiving? Do we need to always archive in so many different ways, using so many different platforms? Why is it very important to remember everything that we do personally, in our personal lives? Do we need to? I guess what I'm looking for is perspective.
Well, as a professional archivist, I archive almost nothing of my personal life, because I feel that's what I do for work, so I don't even have a photo album online or physically. Sure. So I do feel we are in a way over archiving, but it's basically, it is a personal preference, and people do fall in different places in the narcissism versus privacy line. So in a way, yes, I do feel that that's exactly why I say it's the situation is very frequent when you don't archive something and then just later you go back and realize it grew into something that is worth archiving, and that's what actually is much more. I think the situation is much more frequent than you would think. And then you go into this triage mode when you feel, okay, so what are the boundaries of this thing that I consider important enough for archiving? Because you cannot archive every single trace of yourself, every single email you should let's go for lunch. But, at some point you'll get to the situation probably where something you considered not important, you all of a sudden see as part of something important. And then the question is, what do you do with the stuff that is not tagged, not organized, or not preserved in a regular manner? So yes, in this case, thesis and courseworks is much more self-evident thing that's probably will be archived and taken care of. as people go, and that's the best practice. But you know, I just think people don't know what's important, what's not very often, until sometime, some years later, when they look back and all of a sudden they see that something they didn't think is important, and then you can go archive and back them up in as many places as you like.
I want to give kind of a funny example of that, actually, because during the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal was a moment where lots of folks were switching over to, digital, born digital photography and video for news services. And so actually after the scandal broke, obviously Lewinsky and President Clinton never appeared together again, but they had in the past a couple of times, and there was only one fellow who happened to have video footage of them together, so that became the shot that everybody saw. And at the time nobody knew it would ever be relevant. But to flip that on its head, I think one of the things that really all the speakers have hit on is if you don't have a strategy for managing your personal archives, then you're going to end up in that over-archived position of you've got everything and you don't know what everything is. So actually taking some time to think about how can I organize this, how can I maybe automate some of the file naming or things like this in order to really make it easier for me down the road to say, oh, this is what's important, this is what's not. Not that you necessarily need to make the decision today about what to keep and what to throw out, but at least make some decisions about how you're going to organize it that you can go back and find it later and figure out what's what.
Yeah,
I think it's important.
I think it's sort of close to the issue we were talking about. You have to continue to manage your data, and probably I find that I usually need something just after I've thrown it away. But leaving that aside, is there any sense of personal doom? That there's some sense in saying, asking yourself, am I going to need this? And then go back later and say, did I really need these things? And sort of cull things out. I mean, certainly one doesn't need every issue of every paper one has ever written, because that begins to be such clutter, you don't get to what you need. The other thing, though, that is an interesting problem, and I think we're just getting our heads around it as a society, so much is digitized now that never was in the past. It's as if human speech has suddenly become captured, and it's hard. We look at it, it looks like the kind of written text we had in the past, and we think we've got to have all of this, and it can be used, as Rob's example shows. But I think we do need a little bit of a sort of reality check, like that your question poses. Do we really need all of this stuff? At some point, does it become so vast and so cluttered that it prevents us from really getting to anything that we need?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, at least for me personally, I find I don't throw away anything. I feel like I'm putting a few boxes in a warehouse. That's how I feel in relationship to the storage that I have available to me for pennies. Then I don't run into this problem down the line of not finding stuff, because I was just kidding about not putting metadata. I am really obnoxious about putting metadata on everything that I grab, on the important things that I grab. But I gotten also really good at distinguishing what's ephemera for me and what's not. And though I am able to find it later, even though it's in some arcane folder structure, just through the search box. In that sense, I don't feel the need to throw away anything. And the concept of clutter doesn't mean anything to me because it's digital. It's not really a space, even though I'm still forced to use a special metaphor. That I don't know. Is it psychological, the need to throw away stuff? Maybe because it's not material. It's not really a material need that we have right now to throw away anything that we have.
It's clearly psychological, the need to hold on to everything.
Yeah.
I'll give you that.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, and I think the issue this poses, I know for me, and probably for a lot of people who are thinking about, their personal papers, their tax returns, the photographs they have. I mean, it's just the time. And I know that the time saver is to really sit down, think about what your priorities are, and to make a plan and then execute it. But I think even it's so overwhelming that even doing that and hearing all of these things, and even going to, I read a few posts that are linked to from various places that you've noted about. Advice about personal digital archiving, and there'll be one person giving an example, but it's not really a viable example for me, and so then I feel like I'm not I took the time, and I'm still completely confused and lost. And so I think for most people that is a huge impediment. Like, I just need to start, but I'm so overwhelmed with the idea of like file naming conventions, like, you know, for my thousands of photographs. I mean,
Oh no, file name convention photographs are easy. You just give them the place and the date. And you know, for extra credit, the names of people on it. That's all you need. You know, it's not, I mean, that's actually not as hard because it doesn't, you don't need to make a perfect decision, just some kind of decision. You know, it doesn't describe everything, just, you know, enough for you to be able to navigate it and boil down your photographs to like 100 photographs, which then you can just click through and find what you need. So no, I mean, there is no perfect solutions. But I mean, mostly it's just don't go into using any spiffy new tool until you're putting a lot of something into that, until you figure out how do you get this information out of there when it dies or no longer can keep your stuff or when you're tired of it. That's the main thing. But you know, it's not, it's all about just best cost-benefit analysis. So don't, I mean, I'd say put more effort into something that's, you know, very important and you're going to reuse a lot. You know, put less effort into something that you might use at some point. And, you know, any naming convention is better than no naming convention. So, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect at all.
Just to add a little more complexity to the whole issue. Maybe you have some recommendations in this, but in a simpler sense, how do you recommend, if you have, say, multiple instances of a file, if something you go back and edit, it's as simple as a Word file or something that, you know, do I keep all my different versions of it? Do I archive all that? And then a more complex issue is, well, we work with video. All this stuff we're doing is going to get archived, hopefully. Often what we do, and audio might be the same, it's also, you come run into similar problems. You have the material that you're editing by proxy, but then you have the actual project files, which is a format of whatever the software you're using, and then you have ancillary material that you're adding to it, especially with video. So we may take these slides, we might cut them in, so we have to package that all up and then archive it together because later on down the road, we may not have all that material. So there is sometimes a little more complex than just saying I'm going to have this one file to back up, because that one file may depend on other files as well.
Absolutely true, and in audio as well. Yeah. Audio projects very often have, you know, in a modern digital audio workstation environment, you're going to have reverb settings, plugins, all of these things, and many, you know, most of these are proprietary types of formats. It does have to be kind of saved in one big ball of wax, and there is the very real problem of the fact that you're relying on that manufacturer's particular setup. You know, there are some options and tools you can use to try and move beyond that, and probably in other things besides audio and video as well, like open formats, you know, open source software as far as possible. So wherever you're able to move into that open area, I think that's recommended just in terms of being able to survive.
So also, so archiving the system in which that your files exist is also becoming more and more of everyday practice, because people are just creating virtual machines everywhere and saving them. Something we should have done in the 90s and the 80s, but now it's very easy to replicate the state of your machine right now, as it is, and worry about keeping the virtualization alive in the future. But you should be able. I mean, we're getting really good at this, so that's not going to be a problem. I mean, with video, we're talking about a lot of gigabytes. So I don't have that. I can't speak to that directly because you guys are.
In itself, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. But as for how many drafts to keep, that's always been a question, even with analog, you know, especially, you know, with publishers or writers' archives, you know, it's always a question. The answer is you decide on a case-by-case basis. There is nobody can give you an answer of how many drafts to keep. You know, you keep, like you decide, you look how big they are, and you decide how many you want to keep, and then you pick the ones that are different, representatively different enough. And again, you know, you don't strive for a perfect solution. You just strive for some kind of meaningful solution that works for you for that particular case. So with the drafts, depending on how big the work is and depending on how substantially different the drafts are, but 3, 4.
With text, though, I don't know about video, but with text, it's become so easy just to not even worry about it by using any number of versioning systems out there. I'm a bibliographer by trainer, so and I'm of the genetic criticism school, which means that my job is to go back into author's archive and reconstruct the writing process by looking at all these versions, trying to recover as many as I possibly can. And every time you're always missing that one that's going to give you the clue to unraveling the mind of the author, right? So I will always be in the school of thought that says, please save everything. Please make it easy for the scholars of the future to recover your genius.
Yeah, I mean, one of the advantages is sort of a double-edged sword with video and audio is because when you edit, you're editing non-destructively. The original files are always there as they were, but then you have to think about what you're editing and the file you're editing on the software you're using, and as mentioned, the different effects or ancillary material, other video, other sources, all has to go into the same box, or else it doesn't matter that you have the original file, because once you have that finished file, if you ever want to go back to it, whenever, years down the road or whatever, you don't have that, it doesn't matter anymore. You got to start from scratch. You're lucky you have the original material, but the video or the audio, but all that other stuff could be gone.
Yeah, that's the other thing. This might sound philosophical to some of you, but it's actually something that can be empirically proven, which is that when we talk about archiving or saving this item, we're never talking about the same item. Any time that we archive, we are creating an edition, a different one. I'm convinced there is no such thing as lossless. Everything is loosey. And I understand why we want to keep that distinction in audio, but everything loses something and gains something on the way. And any process of archiving, any remediation that we do, any transfer from this place to another is going to add stuff, it's going to lose stuff, no matter what it is, text, video, audio. So this is another thing we should keep in mind when we're thinking about these things, not to advocate or preserve this idea that we're somehow getting access to some original that just thought I'd make that philosophical point.
It does get philosophical. I understand where you're coming from with that. I mean, I think bit perfect is a technical term and it means an exact copy, but context is missing from that idea. So I think you're absolutely right. And I'd just like to chime in one more thing on the idea of versions, because I do creative work myself, and you're saying you'd like all the versions to be kept. I always find I've come over time to think embrace loss, because you have the option to save everything. I commit to this version. I'm going to purge these old ones because I'm just going to take a stand with this version, and this is going to be it. Because I find it's distracting to have the old stuff there. So it's just my own personal practice. But
and I think that's a lot of people's practice at some level when they're putting something out in a sort of public way, is to want to control their legacy by controlling what are the versions that are left behind.
There are so many steps and steps back and steps forward. At least I find when I write something that the notion, and sadly my notion about throwing things away is because I don't throw enough away. But I find it very confusing to look at all of those states of something, because I just think of this PowerPoint I did where I have, there are now 3 states of that PowerPoint. I want to throw all of them away except for one. So part of it is saying, how important is this? How much do I really care about getting back to this? It's so easy to make a new version, as you yourself have said. Every time you save it, you've created something new. Every small change you make is a slightly different version, and one almost needs to clear some of that up so there isn't the noise, so there's a little bit of a focus.
Alex, maybe was it Salman Rushdie that has his whole computer virtually?
Oh, yeah.
I think that was a fascinating
in Emory University.
Yeah.
But I think, for the price of that project, you can build a new house or something. It's crazy. It's like one of the examples that looks really great when you talk about it, but it's not scalable at all. It's one-of-a-kind deal where they emulate, basically you can come and work with Salman Rushdie's computer. Basically it's the emulation of his Macintosh or whatever I think he used with all the drafts, everything is there. But this is, you cannot realistically scale it up to, let's say, how we have 1,000 collection of 1,000 different people, you can't give it that treatment. So it's basically, it's a one-time showcase more than a principle.
It can be, I mean, but it's the first of a kind though, so I mean, my PC was like $10,000 5 years ago, and now it's 2, so it's...
I know, but unfortunately, you know, the output that we have to deal with also grows along. So
Right,
like, so
right,
where
right.
Salman Rushdie had one small old Mac, the writers now generate God knows what.
Yeah.
So yes.
Real problems, real issues.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and this is going to be up on the web hopefully quite soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.